The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again, another episode of Genesis. As always, I'm your host with the most, Ian Kahanowitz. We got recurring author Todd Masters coming back to the show. We had Todd on a couple of months ago in a great interview about his book on Alan Trammell. And we stick in the Michigan area, and we're going to go back in time with the time machine to the 1972 Detroit Tigers. Billy Martin and the half-game champs, and they're going to define that. We're going to go through the first Major League Baseball strike ever, Marvin Miller, Billy Martin, Mickey Lalich. Oh, we got Al Kaline. We got so much to talk about. We got Louis Tion, Sparky Lyle, the Olympics. This is going to be one heck of a fantastic show. Even big Frank Howard's in the picture here. So stay tuned. We're going to get Todd on the show in about 2 minutes, but of course, as always, you are listening to my show, Genesis. We are on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. We are in the off-season. Winter meetings are coming up. Can't wait to see what's going on there. Hey, we got the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho. He's our producer. He's making great shows out there. Golenbach University with Peter Golenbach and Halbach and Vintage Sports. Bill Kashatis, he's out in Philadelphia regarding everything. Oh, we got Nancy Finley out in Oakland, whose Oakland A's, by the way, on the Charlie O, who was her uncle, beat the 72 Tigers. But we're going to get into that, and it's an honor to have Nancy because you get the family view of things. You know, Charlie O wasn't a very liked person. I had Jason Turbo on the show earlier this year. We spoke about his book on the 70s A's, the 60s and 70s A's, and we know that Charlie Finley wasn't the most likable guy, but we get a different perspective from Nancy Finley because it's a first-hand perspective, and even if it goes according to what most authors say or do, it is a personal first-hand look at what those Oakland teams back in the 60s and 70s went through, at least from the side of her father, Carl, and, of course, Charlie O. But network's growing. I got 2 more shows to end my first run of my second season here, because then afterwards in Massachusetts, I got to serve jury duty. And, you know, I don't know how lawyers and judges in this wonderful Commonwealth have to be served as jurors. I already know the rules of evidence. I practiced before a courtroom for 20 years, and they'll make me foreman, and I'll have to sit on a jury for 2 weeks. So go figure that. It hasn't snowed yet in Massachusetts, but I'm sure it's going to get here. But anyway, going on to the topic today, hey, you know something? I love books like this. And even before I get Todd on the show, a book was written probably about 2008, published in 2010. McFarland, I have to read this blurb right from the book because it's going to explain a lot. And I'm really excited about this book. It's so let me begin by this. After winning the 1968 World Series, and we had Tim Wendell on the show to tell us about the summer of '68 and the World Series, so all of you who listen to me are familiar with that. The Detroit Tigers looked to be sliding their way into obscurity, though they still had some marquee players, including Al Kaline and Norman Cash, Mickey Lalich, and Freehan. The dynastic Baltimore Orioles seemed to have passed them by, and of course, they won 3 championships from 1969 to 71. But then in a move that stoked the competitive fires of the team, Detroit hired manager Billy Martin, my man, and everybody knows I speak to Gabe Paul's daughter. So she dated Billy Martin. I get a first-hand account of her and Billy Martin, and I just love Jenny Paul, and she tells me about all this times in the 70s, and Billy's on the forefront, but he was on the forefront of Detroit here. He was the star second baseman as Yankees team that won 5 World Series and whose managerial debut in 1969 ended in the League Championship Series. Told against the backdrop of a momentous summer in American history, this is the story of a great team's last hurrah. And, of course, Todd Masters has been a Tiger fan for well over 45 years. and is a lifelong student of the game's history. He's in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Welcome to the show, Todd.
Thanks, Ian. Good to be with you again.
All right, you know something? Let me just say something here. You were a little boy in 1972. What were you, 10 or 11?
Yeah, I think I was 10 years old. It was really the first season that I really remember well and was, well engaged, understood the game, I guess you'd say, and made an impression on me.
Yeah, and you know something? This book made a hell of an impression on me because I learned a hell of a lot about battling Billy and all this. Why the 72 Tigers? Why not the 87 Tigers?
Well, I had the idea to write about that season probably for 15 years before I ever, committed to actually, doing the research and starting to write something about it. I just thought there was a ton of good storylines with that season. And as you alluded to in your intro, the gang that won the '68 World Series in Detroit, it's a very iconic team, had a lot of players who played many years in Detroit. A lot of them were from Michigan or from the upper Midwest, so they were, local boys, so to speak. But that team was getting old by '72, and as you said, that was really that team's last hurrah. They made one more run at a World Series. As we'll talk about, they came up a little bit short, but I thought there was a lot of interesting storylines. It was a very interesting and really a kind of a break point in baseball history as well that season.
Now let me ask you this. My man, Denny McClain, who I have the honor of speaking to, I usually speak to him by phone, and he doesn't open up about his bad things. Why would he? Guy wins 30 games, 31, wins 24, yet he's on the trading block. What's going on here?
Yeah, Denny McClain was, he's one of those lightning rod, polarizing figures in baseball history. He'd been a good pitcher in the early to mid-'60s for the Tigers, had a lot of potential, but seemed to be one of those guys that, never really lived up to his potential. And then '68 comes along, and, I think he was the fourth starter for manager Mayo Smith to start that season, but he started winning games, and he was winning them easily. He was just dominating hitters in that year of the pitcher, 1968, and had one of those unbelievable seasons in baseball history. Was 31-6 record-wise, and ERA below 2. Was the most valuable player and the Cy Young Award winner in the American League. Next year, it comes back, wins 24 more games, shares the Cy Young Award that year as well, but he was starting to make enemies, I guess, within the Detroit organization at that point. He tended to always look for ways to bend, if not break, the rules. And truthfully, the Detroit management was getting a little bit fed up with his act. And so when things went south for him in 1970, he got suspended a couple times for different things, and his arm, he was starting to have a lot of arm issues by that time. They were quick to move him to the Washington Senators after the 1970 season. They got a haul for him. They basically rebuilt their whole left side of the infield. They picked up Aurelio Rodriguez to play third base, Ed Brinkman to play shortstop, and then as kind of a throw-in, they got Joe Coleman, who is probably the Washington Senators' best pitcher at that time in the late 60s, early 70s, even though he was very young at that time. And really that made a huge difference in the Tigers as they kind of tried to reestablish themselves in the early 1970s.
And, we really don't talk about much about Jim Campbell, who was the executive and vice president and general manager of the Tigers. How important was that trade, though? I mean, you're giving up your blockbuster pitcher. Now you're getting all these different guys, which ended up, turning the Tigers around, like you just mentioned.
Yeah, Jim Campbell, is known as being a very conservative, both fiscally and socially, I guess you'd say. Was very much an old school baseball guy. He believed in, what took place on the field was the product. No gimmicks with, he didn't like giveaways and things like that at games. He's very conservative with the type of music and stuff that was played at the ballpark. He liked organ music and the Tigers were very much in his image, and as well as the owner, John Fetzer. Very conservative organizations. They were all about, making a buck. They weren't in it necessarily to make huge money, but they certainly weren't going to lose money. So they were, in later years, they were very slow to embrace any kind of free agency. In fact, when the free agent draft of eligible free agents took place in the first iterations of free agency in the mid-1970s, Detroit declined to even draft anybody. I mean, that's how conservative they were. And a lot of it was just Jim Campbell's personal opinion about free agency. It was going to be the ruination of the game, and, he wasn't going to participate in that. So, but he made a couple of very controversial at the time moves, and the trading of McLean was certainly one of those. I mean, you're talking about a guy that was traded 2 years after he wins 31 games, barely a year after he wins 24 games, gets basically, shuttled to the Washington Senators, the worst team in the American League. But in hindsight, it's one of the greatest trades in Detroit Tigers history with the haul that I mentioned.
And what's also strange about this whole thing? We got conservative Mr. Jim over here, and he's doing whatever he can, Mr. Campbell. And all of a sudden, he's bringing in Billy Martin. He argued with Clark Griffith. He brought the '69 Twins to, the first American League championship. However, Billy was known as a problem child. Go back to the Yankees. What's going on with Billy?
Yeah, that was probably even more surprising at the time, the hiring of Martin by the Tigers, than the trade of McLean, which came just a few days after that hiring of Martin. Martin had been a good player that had come through in the clutch with the Yankees back in the 1950s during their dynasty, especially in the first half of that decade. But, he was always associated with some incidents, some bar brawls and that type of thing that took place that, gave a black eye to the Yankees. And the Yankees especially they viewed him as a bad influence on a couple of his close buddies who were, two of the star players of the Yankees in the 1950s, Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford. And I believe the general manager's name was Bob Weiss. When he got a chance, he traded Martin to the Kansas City A's, who, similar to the Washington Senators of the late 1960s, they were the worst team in the American League in the 1950s. And Martin was very bitter, very depressed about that trade, leaving the Yankees. He loved being a New York Yankee. And he really just kind of had a checkered career as kind of a utility type guy the rest of his playing career, got in some on-field fights and that type of thing. And when he got out of the game, he, as a player, he got hired by the Twins primarily as a scout, and then as he ended up coming back to uniform, and he was a base coach at different times for the Twins. 1968, he became the manager of their AAA farm club, and had did a phenomenal job turning that team around that season. And he was rewarded by getting the Twins job as their manager in 1969. It was the expansion year, so first year that the American League was split into two divisions, and the Twins just ran away with the division. Martin is generally given a lot of credit for developing, a very aggressive style of play with the Twins at that time. They had the players to do it. They had guys like Rod Carew and Tony Oliva and Leo Cardenas and Cesar Tovar. So, he could do a lot of things. He hit and run a lot. He sacrificed bunt. He stole bases. He had Rod Carew, I think, steal home like 7 times in 1969. And as I mentioned, I think they won 97 games, ran away with the American League West, and then were kind of unceremoniously swept by the Baltimore Orioles, who were just in a whole other world at that point. I think they won 109 games in 1969. And that was the beginning of a 3-year stretch where they won over 100 games each season, and were really one of the best teams in baseball history over that kind of an extended period. But as had often been the case with Martin, he had some off-field issues. He had gotten in a fight with the Twins' traveling secretary at one point in the past, and that hadn't gone over well with Clark Griffith, who was the owner. The traveling secretary had been a buddy of his. But then what probably sealed the deal was Martin, and it was actually outside of a bar in Detroit. He beat up one of his pitchers, Dave Boswell, I believe was the pitcher, knocked him out cold out in the alley outside of a bar one night, and it was over a disagreement about how one of the coaches was handling his situation, and obviously, got a lot of negative publicity from that. And then with the way the season ended, with them getting swept in the playoffs, rather surprisingly, the Twins just decided that they weren't going to bring Martin back. So Martin spent all of 1970 in exile outside of baseball.
And something, let's talk about the Baltimore Orioles. Again, like the Oakland A's of the latter 80s into the early 90s, 3 World Series they went to. They won 1, but how can you give away Frank Robinson? And that's huge. I mean, when they did that, all of the American League East is like, woohoo, we got a chance now.
Yeah, Baltimore had they had one of the great everyday lineups and let's say modern baseball history. I'll say since World War II. Iconic players like Brooks Robinson and Boog Powell and Paul Blair and Davey Johnson and Mark Belanger, but the real leader by all accounts was Frank Robinson. He's the guy that he was the tough out. He was the guy that opposing pitchers and managers feared, especially when the game was on the line. He played with an edge. He was aggressive on the bases, and when I mean aggressive, I don't mean he was a big base stealer, but he took infielders out. He was aggressive, taking extra bases. He was a really good hitter in the clutch. So he was the guy that gave them a hard edge, and was a difference in their team. And as I said, they won over 100 games 3 years in a row. And very surprisingly, the Orioles, who were always a very forward-thinking organization during that period, they saw an opportunity to really replenish their farm system. They already had one of the most productive farm systems in all of baseball during that period, but they traded Robinson to the Los Angeles Dodgers after the 1971 season to make room for Merv Rettenman to play right field. Merv Rettenman had been one of these guys that had come up through the Orioles system and had just torn up the minor leagues, and then he'd played as a backup, a fourth outfielder for several years for the Orioles, and hit over 300 each year, and just showed a lot of promise, and they felt like they had to make room for him. So when they had a chance to raid the Dodgers and take a lot of young players, I think Doyle Alexander was one of the key parts of that as a young pitcher that came over from the Dodgers. They made the move, but Billy Martin, who by then had come to Detroit as manager and had managed in the 71 season, he really saw that as a crack in the armor of the Orioles, that it was a move that he felt they were going to regret and open the door to the rest of the American League.
Let me ask you this. Even before 72, let's go into the 71 season, and then we'll talk about behind the scenes what's going on with Marvin Miller and the whole players union and all that before the strike of 72. Would you say the seeds were sown for the 72 Tigers in 71?
Yeah, absolutely. The Tigers, after they won the World Series in '68, they came back the next year and they just got routed. I think I described it as they got lapped. Baltimore won the division over them. Detroit finished second in 1969 in the American League East, but I think they finished like 19 games behind the Orioles or something like that. It wasn't even close. And, at that point, some of the antics of McClain were starting to wear on the rest of the team, and there was a lot of divisiveness within the clubhouse there. And 1970, everything just fell apart. They had some injuries. The morale was really bad. And they had a losing record, came in fourth place. And Mayo Smith had been their manager for the previous 4 seasons. And Mayo Smith, whether fairly or unfairly, is kind of painted as a manager who kind of came along for the ride, I guess I'd say, for 68. He's not given a lot of credit for, really guiding them through the season. It was just kind of he was at the helm, and they weren't a team that did a lot strategically. They kind of went up there and swung the bats, and they had a lot of guys have a very, very good seasons in ~68, and it was a very power-laden team, and everything just kind of came together for them. And by the end of 1970, it appeared that they had a lot of players that were in decline, and Smith didn't look like the guy that could lead them any longer. And about halfway through that season, when it became apparent that the train was going off the tracks, Jim Campbell had started kind of having some secret conversations with Billy Martin, which, again, as we said before, is kind of surprising because Martin had this reputation already as being kind of a rebel and very volatile, and Campbell was the ultra-conservative executive, so it was kind of a strange marriage. But I think within 1 or 2 days after the season ended, the Tigers fired Mayo Smith and kind of simultaneously announced the hiring of Billy Martin as manager of the Tigers. And 1971, the Tigers started out kind of slow, kind of nondescript. They played about 500 for the first half of the season, but the second half of the season, they started to take to Martin's leadership. He seemed to ignite a spark in them, and they played with a lot more intensity, and they actually made a run at the Orioles late in the season. They beat them head-to-head like 5 straight times, and they got kind of within striking distance in mid-September, and the Orioles just went on another streak and just kind of ran away with it again. But the Tigers, I think they had the 4th best record in all of baseball that year. They won over 90 games and just kind of cemented themselves as, okay, they're back on the upswing, or at least they've stopped the slide, and maybe with a couple key moves they could really make a run at the Orioles in '72, which would be Martin's second year with the team.
And while that was happening, Billy Martin, I always say, one of the greatest managers to ever, manage in the leagues, only because he was a student of Casey Stengel, who was a student, of course, of John McGraw. So you're doing this kind of fired-up baseball that's going back to the dead ball era. And Billy, learned from Casey. Of course, Casey rode the bench for a few years with the New York Giants, and Martin was Casey's boy. He played for him out in Oakland with the Oakland Oaks in '48. And, bringing him over, he was pretty much a student of Casey Stengel. And his firebrand of managerial styles can shock into life any team. I think the 69 Twins, the 72 Tigers, and, of course, the 81 A's are huge products of instant success with Billy. The problem is he gets self-destructive. And when he gets self-destructive, all that stuff that he's pumped in and has been brought up and brought out the best of his players goes down the tubes. By the way, when did the Tigers fire Martin?
Martin was fired by the Tigers in September of 1973.
Yes, it was a year after, because he doesn't last long. He'll build a contender, but his destructive behavior, and it shows with Steinbrenner, how many hirings and firings and how many pennants he went with the Yankees, and the fights with Reggie. And it's hard to keep two people on a team that's as combustible, like a McClain and Martin, or a Jackson and Martin. It's a recipe for disaster. Okay. Before even spring training begins, what's going on with the Players Union?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost humorous to look back now at the issues they were talking about. Not so much the issues, but the money that was involved. But the Players Association had threatened to strike before the '72 season started. And it was all about the funding for their pension fund. They felt that the TV revenue that was nowhere near money like we're talking about today, but they didn't feel the Players Association didn't feel that the pension fund was being funded fairly. That the scale had changed, and the owners hadn't upped the ante to what was getting contributed to their pension fund. So with Marvin Miller leading the Players Association, they had threatened to strike before the '72 season started, but the owners really didn't take them serious, and spring training started as normal across baseball, and the exhibition games, the Grapefruit season and the Cactus League season played out pretty much as scheduled, and they got to about mid-March, and they saw that nothing was changing in their negotiations with the owners, and Miller started coming around and having meetings with each of the teams, the players, and that was when they, the players had to vote. Each team had to vote whether they were willing to go on strike or not. And I think what surprised the owners, as well as probably even a lot of the players, is that there was unity there. The players were willing to do what they had to do to make a stand. And come March 31st, they walked out. They said they weren't going to start the season.
And it's interesting because they called the owners bluff. The owners were like, "Look, we're losing too much revenue," because most people don't realize that yes, revenue at the gate was still the number one way that these teams made money. But the morons who redesigned the schedule didn't do it evenly for every team out there. What was going on with this?
Yeah, that was actually a symptom that came from negotiations to end the strike, so to speak. One of the points that was being debated at the end, once they kind of got past the pension funding issue, was okay. The first 15 days effectively of the regular season, or they started 15 days after they went on strike. So I think like the first 8 days actually of the regular season had already been canceled at the point that they were ready to go back and play. But one of the things that had to be negotiated was, okay, what's going to happen? The players weren't getting paid during the strike. Are the owners going to go back and pay the players? Are the players going to make up those games and those dates? And there wasn't any resolution. The owners wanted the games to be rescheduled, but there was no way they were going to pay the players for those dates that had gone by. And the players were like, well, there's no way we're going to play those games if we're not going to get paid. So what they ended up doing is they ended up saying, okay, fine, we'll just start the schedule at the point that the teams are ready to go back to work and play, and we'll just forget about the games that have gone past. So what happened is over the first week of the season, with off days and things like that, travel, the teams had been scheduled to play a different number of games. I mean, anywhere from 4, 5, 6, 7 games could have been lost during that period, but it was an uneven amount across, the whole 24 teams, I think, at that time. So in the end, you ended up with the games that were going to be played from April 15th on through the rest of the normal schedule was uneven for as far as the number of games for each team.
And that would come back really, at the end of the season when Boston was only a half game, for God's sakes. Why did they leave it like that with the half game? If you look at the columns, you could see, there's a game missing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing that they just thought it would never come down to something like that, but it.
What a mess. Well, anyway, with the 72, team, what are the good stories of the 72 Tigers was Bill Feehan. Let's talk about Bill Feehan and why he was such a leader and what kind of catcher was he?
Well, Freehand had been around for a long time at that point. He'd come up to the Tigers in the very early 1960s. Again, he was one of these local guys. He was a Detroit kid. Went to the University of Michigan, played football and baseball there, was an All-American in baseball. And Tigers signed him. This is pre-draft era. Had signed him to a pretty sizable bonus at the time to turn professional, and he'd very quickly come up to Detroit. This is like 1962, I think, he made his debut. And in a very short time, he'd become, the regular catcher in Detroit, and really he was very good. He was very adept at managing a pitching staff. Pitchers of that era all had a lot of confidence in him, and guys like McLean and Lolich and, later Joe Coleman, guys like that had a ton of trust in him and a working relationship. And, he was also a very good offensive player. He at his peak, he was a 20-plus home run guy, and he typically hit 5th, 6th, 7th, somewhere like that in the lineup, so he drove in a lot of runs. And, he was kind of he could be outspoken in some ways, not outspoken like a Reggie Jackson or something like that with the media, but he wasn't above challenging guys in the clubhouse, and, he was viewed as one of the team leaders.
And let me ask you this. The 72 Tigers, when you look at their hitting, I mean, Al Kaline and Norm Cash, let's face it, they're in the twilights of their careers. They're both 37-year-old. Big old Frank Howard, they got 38 years old. Their batting averages were awful. But the crux of this team, and I always say good pitching can win champions for you. What's up with the Tigers pitching?
Yeah, the pitching that year, what Martin had, and it was consistent with a theme you'd see through his managerial style and his other stops, and you saw it later when he had the Billy Ball era with the A's, but he liked to ride his horses, so to speak, his workhorse pitchers, and nowhere did he have better players that fit that description than when he managed in Detroit. He had a guy in Mickey Lolich who just truly had a rubber arm. He pitched over 370 innings in 1971. Had close to 30 complete games, something like that. With the 72 team, one of the things Martin had really wanted in the offseason was for them to pick up another starting pitcher. He had McLean or Lolich and Joe Coleman who had both won over 20 games in 1971, but they didn't have much of anything really behind them in the starting rotation. And they started 72 the same way. It was basically they would do anything they could to pitch Lolich on 2 days rest sometimes. If there was an off day mixed in, he would jump him over other guys who maybe, now they would never do that. They pretty much go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and stick to that order no matter how the off days go. But back then, Martin would, he'd pitch Lolich, Coleman. If there was an off day maybe in there, he might come right back to Lolich again and pitch him that fourth day. He really rode those pitchers. If you look at the final stats, Lolich and Coleman pitched 80 games or started 80 games of the 156 that Detroit played that year. So over 50% of the starts were by two pitchers.
And they had the pitching, but here come the Yankees and Red Sox. Let me ask you this: they got Sparky Lyle, the Yankees. What kind of impact did they have for that team?
Yeah, the American League East. By no means were the 72 Tigers a great team. They were not. The 72 season was a strange season. It was expected to be a battle between the Tigers and the Orioles, with the Red Sox and Yankees maybe being longer shots or dark horses, I guess you'd say, for the division that year. But neither the Tigers or the Orioles really took the bull by the horn, so to speak. The Orioles really underachieved the whole season. The Tigers played probably about to their potential. They struggled to score runs consistently, and like I said, they had while Lolich and Coleman were as good as any duo anywhere in baseball, they just didn't have a lot behind them. So, every third and fourth day it became a struggle to figure out who was going to pitch and how they were going to win and that type of thing. But the Yankees and the Red Sox kind of stayed within striking distance the first half of the season, and then the second half, they both got hot, and the Yankees had made a trade with the Red Sox in spring training, where they had traded, I believe it was Danny Cater, who was a first baseman, to the Red Sox for Sparky Lyle, who had fallen out of favor in Boston. And Lyle had always been a quality reliever, but he just took it to another level in 72. There was a point in like July, August where, he was pitching almost every day and really kind of leading the renaissance of the Yankees, where, they were playing like a house of fire and really got themselves into the race.
And I'll tell you, 72. Here we go. Louis Tiant, I love the way that you wrote. He was pretty much in the scrap heap, starting the season. What's going on with good old Louis?
Yeah, Louis Tiant, he was a big part of the Red Sox coming on, kind of their version of Sparky Lyle, only he was a starting pitcher. He had been a very high-quality pitcher for Cleveland back in the 1960s, but very hard thrower. I think he led the league in ERA in 1968. But excuse me, he'd had arm issues and kind of bounced around. I think Minnesota had him for a while in the early 70s, and really was on the verge of falling out of baseball entirely. But the Red Sox had brought him to spring training, I think, in 1971, and he had done just enough to stay in the organization. I think he'd been in the minors for part of the year in 71. 72, he makes the team, doesn't pitch much the first half of the season, but I think at some point mid-year, doubleheaders were starting to stack up. Maybe there was an injury somewhere with a pitcher, and he started getting a couple starts and did very well. And then the second half of the season, he was he was almost unhittable. He had incredible number of shutouts the second half of the season. I don't remember exactly what the number was, but he was truly an ace the second half of the season. I think he ended up like 15-6 or something like that. And like I said, it was almost like he had just a handful of starts the first half of the season.
So the Tigers take the division. They take the division. They had a big series with Boston. They win it. Now they're going against this A's team. And how does the 72 Tigers stack up with an A's team that won the West in 71, lost in the championship to Baltimore? But here we go. Real exciting baseball on the horizon.
Yeah, the Tigers, as you mentioned before, they outlast the Boston Red Sox to win the division by a half game. They win it on the next to last day of the season, beating the Red Sox head to head. And they finished 86-70, which is like a .565 winning percentage or something. So solid, but it's not even as good a winning percentage as they'd had the year before. But in reality, to be truthful, they won a very mediocre division that year. On the other side of the bracket in the American League West, the Oakland A's are, now well established with their dynasty. I think they'd end up winning the division 5 years in a row. And, easily the most talented team in the American League. They've got speed, they've got power, they've got tremendous starting pitching. They've got a very deep and very talented bullpen, and they're very flamboyant. They're all sporting mustaches that season. They wear the flashy uniforms. They've got 3 colors of uniforms. They wear the white shoes. Charlie Finley is, very outspoken and very gimmicky as an owner. And he's just that organization is just the complete antithesis of the Detroit Tigers organization. You've got the very ultra-conservative Tigers and then playing the A's who, wear these flashy gold uniforms and white shoes and long hair and mustaches and besides that, the teams just absolutely hate each other. They'd had a number of beanball incidents over a number of seasons, but in 72 it had flared up again. There had been a brawl in August over a play that I think it was a chopper down the first baseline where a Tiger pitcher had tagged one of the A's runners rather hard right in the face, and it triggered a bench-clearing brawl where, there was some serious punches being thrown, and both teams had a lot of big guys. I mean, big physically imposing guys. So they were both teams that weren't afraid to rumble with each other. And, Billy Martin, he just ate that up. I mean, that just played right to, what he was all about.
Let me ask you this, even before we get to the playoffs, and this is a big one, bat-throwing stuff and everything. We got Black September, and we got the 72 Munich Olympics. Now, even before I go into that, what people ought to know, again, we're 45 years removed from this. This was a big thing for Israel to go back to Germany because of what happened 30 years before. What's going on here with the Olympics?
Yeah, the Olympics, 72 Olympics, Summer Olympics were in Munich in early September of 1972, and again, there was so many things that affected the nation and the world that were happening that summer. When you look back, it was just an incredible year event-wise, but certainly the darkest thing that happened was one of the first days of the Olympics. There was a terrorist group, an Arab terrorist group that took hostage, I believe it was 11 Israeli athletes, and a couple of athletes were killed right in the initial encounter, and then they went into a hostage mode, and there was SWAT teams looking to resolve and save the athletes, and it ended badly. There was I don't know all the details, but there was a grenade that was thrown into a helicopter, and unfortunately, it was a very dark period in Olympic history or any kind of history where all those Israeli athletes were killed.
It's really a misfortune. And I remember you get to see it was basically covered on TV. I forget the announcer, Jim McKay. Yeah, it's amazing.
Very famous clip, yes.
Yeah, and he's back there, and you see Black September, and many people don't know is that the Israelis, Golda Meir, was the prime minister, ordered the Israeli Mossad to go after these guys, which really didn't end until the 1990s, and I read the book on that, and it's amazing how after all these years, these guys who are now, like, say, middle-aged, they're like 20 or 30 when they did it, were getting bumped off by Israeli agents due to the Olympic, disaster. I mean, there's no other word I can call it. But, hey, we're in the baseball playoffs right now. Oakland wins 2 games, right? What's going on in the third game here?
Yeah, the first 2 games of the series were out in Oakland, and going into this, you gotta look back at the history of the playoffs in baseball. Had been just blowout sweeps for the most part. I think there had only been 1 series in either league, and this was the 4th year now of the playoffs in 1972. Playoffs had started in '69, and every series had been a sweep except for 1. I think the Pirates might have won a game somewhere, or vice versa. But there was only 1 series that hadn't been a sweep, and the other one had been a 3-1. They were all best of 5 series. So the playoffs had really seemed like they were kind of very anticlimactic, and a lot of people questioned why they even went away from the single leagues and just having the league champion play the other league champion in the World Series. So A's were a prohibitive favorite over the Tigers, from a talent standpoint, but there was still a lot of pundits at the time who were giving the Tigers a chance because of the great experience they had. They were a very veteran-oriented team. But the A's win the first 2 games out in Oakland. The first game especially was kind of a classic. Lolich was matched up against Catfish Hunter. The game goes 11 innings. I think both pitchers went into the 11th inning. Tigers had taken a 2-1 lead. Kaline had hit a home run in the 11th inning off Raleigh Fingers, and I think it was a 2-1 lead that they took, but they ended up losing the game on a hit with a runner on first and second. The runner on second scored to tie the game, but the runner on third was going to be out by quite a distance, and the ball skipped and hit the runner about the same time he was arriving at the bag, and it went by Aurelio Rodriguez, and the winning run came in, and it really was a back-breaking loss. One of the people I interviewed for the book was Dick Trzeski, who was the first base coach on the Tigers at that time, and he talked about how Kaline had the runner thrown out by he called it half the baseline, and how disappointing that was that they lost the game on that play. And then the next day was probably the most famous day of the series. It's the one where Oakland scores early, knocks Woody Fryman around, and ends up winning 5-0. But the highlight of the game and the thing that people probably remember most about the series is that A's had a shortstop, Bert Campaneris, who was a good fielder, mediocre hitter, but the one thing he could do is he was very quick and very daring on the bases. Led the American League in steals numerous times during the late 60s, early 70s. He'd been a real thorn in the side of the Tigers in this series. It seemed like he was getting on base every time. then he was stealing bases. He was driving the pitchers crazy when he was on bases with these big leads he was taking. Well, Tigers were down big late in that game, and Martin had enough of Bert Campaneris, and he had his pitcher, Laren LeGros, nail Campaneris. LeGros throws a pitch down and in, hits Campaneris right in the ankle. Campaneris goes down. But after pausing and kind of collecting himself, Campaneris gets up and flings his bat, kind of helicopter style, right at LeGros. LeGros ducks way down. The bat goes over his head, and it just triggers another bench-clearing brawl that Martin is just having to be held back by multiple umpires because he's trying to get at Campaneris and teach him a lesson or whatever. But things come back to Detroit, and the Tigers are they're up against the ropes. These are best of 5 series. They've lost the first 2 games. There's no margin of error at this point, and things get interesting though when it gets back to Detroit.
And what goes on in Detroit when it gets back in there?
Well, Coleman does him a huge favor. He pitches a magnificent game in Game 3. He shuts out the A's. One of the best games he pitches of his whole career. Freehan, who'd been injured, comes back in that game. He hadn't caught in the first 2 games. He'd broken his thumb late in the regular season, but he was able to come back and play in Game 3, and I think he had a home run in that game. But just the calming effect he has on the rest of the team, he's given a lot of credit. Game 4 is a classic. It's generally when Tiger Stadium was shut down. Game 4 of the 72 series was considered one of the top 5 games ever played there. Again, it's Lolich and Hunter matched up against each other. It's a very low-scoring game. I think the teams had traded solo home runs through the first 9 innings. Well, the A's end up scoring a couple runs in the top of and I don't remember if it was the 10th or the 11th, but, things looked pretty dour. I mean, this is a very low-scoring series, so a 3-1 deficit in extra innings just looks insurmountable. But the Tigers rally. They get a couple breaks. They get some walks. There's an error. There's a very unusual situation where Dick Williams was forced to play Gene Tennis, who was generally a catcher at second base, and Tennis drops what looked like a round-the-horn double play ball. He dropped the throw from third base, which allowed the Tigers to load the bases, I think, with nobody out. And Tigers end up rallying. They win the game on a walk-off hit by Jim Northrup. So the Tigers have tied the series and have all the momentum. It looks like the A's are kind of unraveling. And, again, they were considered a young team at that point, where the Tigers were all these veterans who had won in '68 and had been through the wars and had the momentum. So Game 5 in Detroit is played on I believe it was a Wednesday afternoon. It's cold, windy, but it's a full house in Detroit. Martin's 1 game away from going to the World Series, and Tigers take the lead in the first inning, scratch out a run, and then the A's tied it in the second on a double steal where Reggie Jackson actually tears up his hamstring, scoring on the front end of the double steal, and he's lost for the rest of the postseason for the A's. But the game's decided. I think it's like the 5th or 6th inning. There's a routine play, a ground ball to short. George Hendrick is the runner. He'd replaced Jackson in that game, and he's out by a couple steps at first base. But the umpire, John Rice, who had a noted feud or dislike for Billy Martin, called the runner safe. He said that Norm Cash had pulled his foot at first base, and you look at the replays of that. I mean, it looks like Cash could have pulled his foot, but what all the players from that era say is that was very common then. It was just kind of a courtesy that they allowed the first baseman to pull their foot so they wouldn't get spiked if it was a routine play, not in a close play, but on a routine play. That was a liberty that they were allowed. And Hendrick ends up coming around to score what turns out to be the winning run. They take a 2-1 lead there. Like I said, I think it was the fifth inning. But what the A's do that really kind of breaks the Tigers' backs is they bring Vita Blue out of the bullpen. He'd been regulated to the bullpen that season or for that postseason. Hadn't had a very good season at all after holding out during spring training. But pitches like he hadn't all season. I mean, he just was throwing gas, and the Tigers just looked every bit their age, trying to catch up with his fastballs, and he basically breaks the Tigers' hearts. He beats them 2-1.
And we can't not talk about the resurgence of Al Kaline that September and October. The guy hit 500.
Yeah, Kaline had one of those Septembers. Probably the most famous one is Carl Yastrzemski's 1967. But Kaline had one of those type Septembers. As we talked about before, the American League East was a real dogfight. It was a 4-team race going into September. Kaline had been in and out of the lineup the whole season. He's 37 years old. He's fighting a lot of injuries, and Martin tended to platoon guys anyway, and didn't rely on everyday players at many of the positions for Detroit during that time. But it got into September, and Kaline just got red hot, and he just played. For somebody like me, who Kaline was more of a name than he was really what I saw. That was my glimpse of seeing how great Al Kaline was how he played, during that time, and then how he played also in the playoffs. I mean, he was just clutch with everything. I mean, got the clutch hits. It seemed like he was getting 2 or 3 hits every game, and really it was kind of his last big hurrah. I mean, he played a couple more years, but never had a streak like that again.
Yeah, it's an amazing season, and we're coming to an end to the show. But let me ask you something. Did I miss some, or would you like to say something that maybe exemplifies the 72 Tigers?
Well, I think, as I said before, it wasn't a great team, record-wise or statistics-wise or anything like that. But what was interesting about that team, or what makes that team interesting to look back at in that season, is that the Orioles were considered unbeatable going into that season, and right from the off season on, I mean, Martin was openly challenging the Orioles verbally, type of thing you wouldn't see today, where everybody's careful about what they say and politically correct. Martin was very direct, and he went after the Orioles verbally and challenged them. He picked little feuds with Earl Weaver and other players, and he was able to cobble together enough to get them through that season. I mean, they had players that were having very mediocre seasons or injuries or whatever, but Martin was constantly tinkering with the lineup, switching guys around, playing them at different positions. He was playing catchers in the outfield. He drew names out of a hat at one point to make his batting order, which I think was highlighted in The Bronx is Burning, one of those episodes for the Yankees. He did that later, but he did it in Detroit quite famously. So, and then they played an epic American League Championship season against the A's, and combined with the series that was going on in the National League with the Pirates and Reds that also went 5 games, that was really the season where the championship series were put on the map, where they really were like, this is compelling baseball. this is worth having. That was the 72 season.
It's such a fascinating account. I know it still sells today. Besides Amazon and McFarland, which has published their new magazine, but I don't know if it's in there because normally they do. Normally when McFarland publishes it, they give some dribs and drabs of those books from yesteryear. But I think you can still get it at McFarland. Where else can we get this wonderful book?
Basically, any of the online booksellers are going to have it. If you just Google 72 Detroit Tigers, it'll usually come up.
Something, Todd, I always love you. I love to have you on the show. We'll get you on again. Hang the line. Hold the line. This is how I end the show, as you well know, and as all my listeners know. Folks, I had a great time with Todd today. A lot of stuff I didn't know about the 72 season. Nevertheless, the 72 Tigers battling Billy Martin should be noted for not only his Yankee stay, but what he did for the Tigers in the 71 and 72 season. If I was Bowie Kuhn, I would have thrown Martin out of that series. I'll tell you that much, Todd, for ordering the hit. On Campaneris. But that's another story for another time. But anyhow, folks, be good, be well, and in the immortal words of Edward L. Murrow, good night and good luck.